Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful.
All right. So the chapter opens up, Leviticus 3. If his offspring is a sacrifice of peace offerings, if he is going to offer out of the herd, whether male or female, he shall offer it without defect before the Lord. I'm going to stop right there and make the first observation of how this is different than some of the other offerings. There's a lot more choice here. It can be either male or female. It can be out of the herd, which would be what? Cattle. We're going to go on and see as we keep going through this chapter that it can be out of the flock, or it can be, which would be sheep or goats. So there's not a particular type of animal. There's not a particular age associated with this sacrifice. It just has to be without defect and before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the head of the offering, and we talked about that with one of the other offerings. That simply seems to be a symbolic way to make connection with the offering, to lay hands on it, and slay it at the doorway of the tent of meeting. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood around on the altar. And from the sacrifice of the peace offerings he shall present an offering by fire to the Lord, the fat that covers the entrails, and all the fat that's on the entrails, and the 2 kidneys with the fat that's on them, which is on the loins, and the lobe of the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys. And Aaron's son shall offer up the smoke from the altar on the burnt offering, which is on the wood that is on the fire. It is an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. So those first 5 verses cover this opening about the peace offering and what to do if it is from the herd. It can be male or female. He's to lay his hand on his head. He's going to kill it at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Who does the killing? The owner. And so we got to understand that. I think some of us sometimes conceive all you got to do is bring your lamb and you drop it off and then they take care of butchering it. That is not the way it works. Aaron's sons take over at that point after you kill the animal. The blood is captured and thrown on the altar, like the other animal sacrifices. The fat that covers the entrails, the visceral fat, the 2 kidneys and the visceral fat around the kidneys, the liver and the fat of the liver, all is burnt on the offering. And it is burnt on top of the burnt offering. Did you notice that as we read verse 5? Aaron's son shall offer up in smoke on the altar on the burnt offering, which is on the wood that is on the fire. So this would be a secondary offering offered after the burnt offering. And these things would be laid upon the coals of the burnt offering. It picks up in verse 6, but if his offering is for a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, if his offering for a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord is from the flock, now I'm going to stop there. This is name number 2 for this sacrifice. What's changing here is the source. And so it's not name number 2, I don't guess yet. We're going to get to name number 2. I'm going to go ahead and stick it in here. I'm going to get ahead of myself, but I'm going to stick it in here. It's going to bug me until I say it. It's also referred to as the fellowship offering. So if you ever hear anybody talk about the fellowship offering, it's the same offering. And we'll get into why, I guess, later when we get there. So if it's from the flock instead of from the herd, he shall be offered male or female without defect. If he's going to offer a lamb for his offering, then he shall offer it before the Lord, and he shall lay his hand on the head of the offering and slay it before the tent of meeting. And Aaron's son shall sprinkle its blood around the altar, and from the sacrifice of peace offerings he shall bring as an offering by fire to the Lord its fat, the entire fat tail, which he shall remove close to the backbone. That is a specific part. I think we talked about that a little bit during the burnt offering, which also could come from the sheep and goats. That portion of the animal was to be offered. The fat that covers the entrails, all the fat that's on the entrails, the 2 kidneys with the fat that's on them, which is on the loins, the lobe of the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys. Then the priest shall offer it up in smoke on the altar as food and offering by fire to the Lord. Moreover, if his offering is a goat, so when you talk about the flocks, it could be sheep or goats. If it's a goat, he shall offer it before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on its head, slay it before the tent of meeting. And the sons of Aaron shall sprinkle its blood around the altar, and from it he shall present his offering as an offering by fire to the Lord, the fat that covers the entrails, all the fat that's on the entrails, the 2 kidneys with the fat that's on them, which is on the loins, the lobe of the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys, and the priest shall offer them up in smoke on the altar as food, an offering by fire for a soothing aroma, all the fat that is the Lord's. I'm going to stop there for a moment. We're getting some, I'm going to say a little foreshadowing here. What's different about, for instance, reading this, and we know what's different between this and the grain offering. Obviously, there's a big difference between this and the grain offering. What is it? The grain offering is bread, this is blood. What's different between this and the burnt offering that we studied in chapter 1? There's really only one word in the part that we've read up to this point in class that it never appears in chapter 1 about the burnt offering. Let's try to remember about the burnt offering then, so we can think about this. What did they do with the burnt offering? They would kill the animal. The blood would be collected to be poured onto the altar. Aaron's sons would then butcher it, put it on the altar, and burn it, right? What parts did they burn? Okay. And what about the rest of it? They burned it all. The burnt offering had to all be consumed on the fire. This uses the word food. Did you notice that word food? That's a little foreshadowing to tell you that there's something different about the sacrifice. Up until this point, it sounds very similar as far as the procedure. But it says something about food. Why does it make that distinction? And this is where we have to kind of start talking about what we're told later in the book about this offering. Before we do that, I'll go ahead and read verse 17. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwellings. You shall not eat any fat or any blood. All right. That also is somewhat important to our discussion that we're fixing to have. Why were they not allowed to eat any fat or any blood? Okay. The life is in the blood. And the fat, okay. Let's just keep these questions open. We're certainly on to something with the first thing, but then we got to think about what that means and how it applies and all that kind of stuff. Let's talk about this in terms of the function of this sacrifice in the biblical story. The peace offering provided a way for the people to share in fellowship with God, which, by the way, is why it's called a fellowship offering. Part of the offering was burned to the Lord. Part of this offering was burned to the Lord. Not all of it. In the burnt offering, it was all burned. Part of this was burned to the Lord. Part of it was given to the priests, and part of it was eaten by the worshiper. So there is some joint participation in this sacrifice, which makes it distinct from the others. What went to the altar was the Lord's portion. Okay, we read about that in verses 3 through 5, about the cattle in verses 9, 10, and 11, about the sheep, and in verses 14, 15, and 16, about the goat. So the fat portions, the fat covering the entrails, the kidneys, the liver, and the fat tail in the sheep, was all burned on the altar as a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Look over in chapter 7. We're going to jump ahead because to understand this sacrifice well, we have to. Chapter 7, verses 31 through 34 is what I want to read. And the priest shall offer up the fat in the smoke on the altar, but the breast shall belong to Aaron and his sons. And you shall give the right thigh to the priest as a contribution from the sacrifices of your peace offerings. The one among the sons of Aaron who offers the blood of the peace offerings and the fat, the right thigh, shall be his portion. So the actual priest who is tending to the altar and puts the sacrifice, he gets the right thigh. I have taken the breast for the wave offering and the thigh of the contribution from the sons of Israel from the sacrifices of the peace offerings. And so the other pieces, the breast and the other thigh, goes into this collection for the priests. This is one of the ways that the priest was fed. And given them to Aaron the priest and his sons, and their due forever from the sons of Israel. This is that which is consecrated to Aaron, and that which is consecrated to his sons from the offerings by fire to the Lord in that day when he. So, what's going on here? Just so you know, I told you these sacrifices come up again in these chapters, chapter 6 and 7. What it starts instructing is these kinds of things. What goes to the priest and what happens here and what is done with this part that isn't talked about. These first chapters are dealing with naming the sacrifices, the procedure of the sacrifices. More details are included later. So we've got now God getting the fat portions and some of the organs and a particular portion of the tail of the sheep. We've got the priests who get the breasts and the thighs, and the guy who actually offers the sacrifice for the priest gets a particular thigh. I'm not sure what made the right thigh special. I don't know why it was the right thigh, but that's the one it was. I'm sure there's a reason. I just don't know what it is. Somebody's watching online might know, and I'll get a message from them, and they'll tell me, oh, you ought to know this. Now, look at verses 15 and 16 of chapter 7. Earlier in chapter 7, it's talking about the peace offering, and it's talking about the peace offering in a little bit different aspects of it. Now, as for the flesh of the sacrifice of his thanksgiving peace offerings, it shall be eaten on the day of his offering. He shall not leave any of it over until morning. But if the sacrifice of his offering is a votive or a free will offering, it shall be eaten on the day that he offers his sacrifice, and on the next day, what is left over may be eaten. So there's some other sacrifices that'll come up later, but of this sacrifice, the one offering the sacrifice gets a portion to eat, but his portion has to be eaten when? That day. It could not be left over. It could not be held for different. Now, there's other sacrifices that they can be eaten the next day. Not this one. This one has to be completely eaten on the day that it is offered. So what we have here in this particular sacrifice is God getting a portion of the animal, the priest getting a portion of the animal, and the offerer getting a portion of the animal. And that joint participation is why it becomes known as the fellowship offering. That and another thing that we'll talk about in just a moment. The sacrifice, and we saw all these words used between the two sections, chapter 3 and chapter 7 that we looked at. The idea of thanksgiving, this idea of communion or fellowship, is pretty distinct in that respect from the burnt offering, which was total dedication to God. That offering was all about God. And this one is emphasizing wholeness and relationship and association. The grain offering was about acknowledging God's provision. So the burnt offering was about acknowledging God. The grain offering about God's provision, his bread. This is about our fellowship. Now, this fat thing, we're going to ask the question. Well, first we'll answer the blood thing because it's pretty direct. That is clearly because it's representative of life. The life is in the blood. All life belongs to who? God. The blood always goes to the altar. Life is God's. So that to me is pretty clear. What about the fat? Apparently, the fat was considered the best or the richest part of the animal. Do you remember when we were talking about the grain offering and it said to offer your fine flour? And we talked about the fact that that could mean that it's ground finely, like cake flour, or it could mean that it's of good quality. And we talked at that time about which seemed more logical, and I told you that I believe it's talking about the quality of it. This is the same kind of thing. God gets the best portions. The Hebrew word, hileb, that is translated fat in all of these verses, sometimes is used to mean the choicest portion or the richest abundance that is there. If you look at Genesis 45 and verse 18, for instance, Go back to Genesis 45 and verse 18. God says, I will give you the fat of the land of Egypt. What did they end up getting of the land of Egypt? Well, yeah, but before that even, when they first moved into Egypt, where did they live? In the land of Goshen, in the good part, in the fertile part. And they prospered well there. That's what God said, I'll give you the best land in Egypt. That's what he meant by that. The choicest portion of Egypt will go to you. In similar fashion, the choicest part of the animal goes to God. Numbers 18 and verse 12. And people that are reading, anybody got the New King James that they're reading out of? And so turn to Numbers 18:12. Just let me know when I read this if the language is any different in that. If anybody's got the original King James or a different translation even than that. I don't remember if I pulled this from the New American Standard or if I pulled it from the ESV, but I pulled it from one of those two. All of the best of the oil, all of the best of the wine and of the grain, the first fruits. And he goes on to say, I give them to you. The word that's translated best here is the same word. Okay. But it uses the word best. Okay, that's the same word that's translated fat in these other passages. That Hebrew word means fat, or it means best, or it means it can be translated different ways. And they look at the context and make a determination about how to use it. Now in Genesis 45:18, it's clearly being used metaphorically to mean the choice, the choicest. So that's another word that could be used to translate it. And so that is why the fat portions always went to God. In all these sacrifices, it's very clear. You take the visceral fat, you take the kidneys, you take the liver, you take these things, and they go on the altar. They go to God. And you get thighs. It's kind of like, you know how the kids always get the drumstick? They don't get the breast and the thigh, they get the drumstick when you're having fried chicken. Was that just when I was a kid? When I was a little kid, my parents would have my mom's brother, my uncle, and his wife and family come over to the house, and they cooked steaks for the adults, and we got sausage. At least that's what I'm told. I was really young. Anyway, that the best went to God. The priest got some pretty good cuts. Who got what's left over? The one who was offering. Now, there's something to think about with regard to that. There's something for us to learn about our offering and how we should make our offerings to God. What should we offer God? Let's talk for a little bit about the messianic significance of this sacrifice. It's referred to as being offered as a burnt offering, a pleasing aroma. There's that phrase again. Also, it was used back in the burnt offering. This points forward to Christ, whose sacrifice is described in Ephesians 5:2 as what? As a fragrant offering to God. So we've got this connection between this sacrifice and the sacrifice of Jesus. They're both pleasing or fragrant aromas. Peace offering anticipates reconciliation and fellowship with God through Christ. Ephesians 2:14 says that Christ, he himself, is our peace. This is a peace offering. It's an offering that reconciles, that that celebrates the fellowship of being reconciled to God. How is that accomplished? Well, he is our peace. He's the one that makes the peace offering effective. The restriction against blood underscores that the life of the flesh is in the blood. That's Leviticus 17:11. What did Christ pour out for our atonement? What did Christ pour out to inaugurate the new covenant? His blood. The significance of the blood is life. So if we move this forward to our acknowledgement of the sacrifice of Christ today, well, we take the bread, which is his body, and the cup, which is the blood of the covenant. We need to understand that represents the life of Christ that had to be given so that there could be a covenant between us and God that provides for us atonement and the forgiveness of sins. We so far removed from the events and only reading about them in a book, I think sometimes I forget somebody had to die for me. In order for me to be a Christian, in order for me to be in a covenant relationship with God, in order for me to be able to have fellowship with God, in order for me to have the hope of eternal life, somebody died. And they died for me. They didn't just die for other people. We talk a lot about telling people that Christ died for them. And we talk about Christ dying for us in this big ubiquitous group. But that life was for me. And when the offerer came with his fellowship offering, with his peace offering, and laid his hand on that animal and slit that animal's throat, he was keenly aware that that animal was dying so that he could have fellowship with God. We forget. That's why there is actually a hymn in our hymnal entitled, "I'm the One." That's what the purpose of that hymn is to make it personal. The words of that song are interesting. I wasn't in the garden. I wasn't, and it takes it step by step through that evening and what happened. But then it gets to the chorus and says, I'm the one who shouted, "Crucify." I'm the one who hung his cross so high. It's personalizing the sacrifice. Something that we miss out on, that studying these sacrifices should help us realize more than we do. Christ is the fulfillment of the peace offering. Keep in mind that Christ said that he came not to destroy the law, but to do what? To fulfill it. Well, Christ is the reason we don't have to offer peace offerings. The reason why you don't have to carry your animal up to a place and slit its throat and go through this process and eat portion of it is because Christ fulfilled this once for all. In Leviticus, the peace offering allows shared communion. That's why part of it went to God, part of it went to the priest, and part of it went to the worshiper. Christ died so we could have fellowship with God. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 through 18 teaches this. Among the things it says there is, for he himself is our peace, who has made both one. Who's the both there in that context? Does anyone remember? I'll give you a hint. One group of the both is the Jews, and the other group is the Gentiles. Both have been reconciled into one body. And then he goes on to say that he might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross. Christ accomplished the purpose of this sacrifice on the cross. Not just the purpose of the atonement sacrifice, not just the purpose of the sin sacrifice, the purpose of the peace offering also happened on the cross. Romans chapter 5 and verse 1, therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. That is how we have peace with God. We share fellowship with God. And so the peace part of the offering is realized in the believer's relationship with God through Christ. It doesn't always serve our interest to be so far removed from the palpable experience of what it took. I believe that the first century Christians who were witnesses of the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross had a very deep appreciation for what it cost for them to have fellowship with God. I'm not sure we always have that kind of deep appreciation. And I'm not sure some of us even had the capacity to have that kind of deep appreciation when we first came to the Lord in obedience. I think that this is one of the kinds of things that is the difference between the new babe in Christ and the one who has grown to be mature in the faith. To start being able to draw these lines of connection and see and understand the depth of what took place. Where would we be without the sacrifice of Jesus? We would be lost, okay. We would be back into the law, although I'll say this, if Christ was never going to come, then we don't have any purpose for the law either. So the law wouldn't have been given. And where would we be? Well, we could answer we wouldn't be here. If it wasn't for the grace and mercy of God, the world could have ended in Noah's day. But instead, he spared 8 souls to give another opportunity. Now, he had already, well, it wasn't written for much later when Moses wrote it, but at the beginning, according to Genesis 3, he had already determined what he was going to do. So there was already a plan. But that has to do with the foreknowledge of God. That doesn't have to do with the circumstances on the earth. He could have rightfully just ended everything. Would it have changed anything for him to end anything for the people involved in that day? I don't know if anybody ever thought about that. See, Noah was a righteous man and blameless before God. If he died, what would have happened to Noah? You would have to assume that he was in a relationship with God. Now, again, controlling for the fact that that depended on the sacrifice of Christ, much later, we're going to just suspend that for a moment. And the world who died in the flood would have died separate from God in their sins, just like they did. It really wouldn't have changed anything for those people for it to end. So the fact that he spared Noah and his sons was really about what? It's really about all of us that came afterward. Well, same thing here. When he gave these laws, and he made these sacrifices, and he gave all these instructions and said, okay, this is how I want you to handle this. And I want you to lay your hand on this animal. And it's got to be an animal that doesn't have any blemish on it. And you got to lay your hand on this animal and familiarize yourself with it and connect yourself to it. And then you take a knife and you cut the thing's throat and take the life from it. I want you to do that so that you understand what it actually costs for you to have peace with me. So that you understand what it actually costs for you to have forgiveness. So that you understand what it actually costs for you to be atoned for. We need to understand those same things. Appreciate everybody's attention and participation tonight, and Lord willing, we'll begin in chapter 4 next time.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory.